Welcome, everyone. My name is Jody Platt. I'm on the faculty here in the Department of Learning Health Sciences, and it's my very excited to present, to open and introduce our Collaboratory event this afternoon. So just a couple of quick logistical things to take care of at the beginning. This session is being recorded. The recording will be available to all attendees and registrants via the Learning Health System Collaboratory website. The session is live closed captioned. And if you have questions, which we hope you do, and we've hopefully we have a lot of time built into the hour for your questions and answers, please post those into the Q&A pod button in the Zoom function. So we're looking forward to a really interesting and engaging conversation today, this afternoon. It's still sunny. With Dr. Khadija Ferryman, who's an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and on the faculty, part of the core faculty at the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. Dr. Ferryman is a cultural anthropologist whose work involves the social, cultural, ethical, and policy implications of health information technologies. Her research specifically focuses on how genomics, digital medical records, artificial intelligence, and other health information technologies mediate the production of social difference and racial disparities in health. We're really looking forward to her talk today. We're also joined today by Paige Nong, who is a doctoral candidate here at the University of Michigan School of Public Health in Health Services Organization and Policy. She's a sociologist and studying health policy. Her research focuses on racism in healthcare and health information technology. So we're looking forward to hearing from everyone today and to the talk. I don't think I have any other sort of things to get. I'm just ready to get started. So Dr. Ferryman, please take over.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I will share my screen now. Hold on. Let's see, one moment. I think I have to stop sharing from before. Okay. There's always a little bit of this, right? Okay, there we go. All right, so hopefully you all can see my screen now, right? Okay, great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, I should say first. And also thank you to Dr. Platt and Paige and the organizers for having me here today. I really look forward to engaging with the panel moderators and the audience. So again, thank you so much for extending this invitation to me today. So before I begin my remarks, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, and I invite you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, the indigenous stewards of the land we now call New York City, where I currently am. And I also invite you to acknowledge Seneca Village, the predominantly African-American community that was displaced to help build New York City's Central Park. And these acknowledgements, if you've seen them before in other talks, in my view, help us to remember historical displacements and erasures and hopefully prompt thinking and action to dismantle their ongoing legacies. So here's my outline for the talk today. I'll start with why we should care about artificial intelligence and health equity. Hopefully I won't have to make too strong of a case here with this audience. And then I'll examine the intersection of federal regulation of artificial intelligence and health equity. And I'll then share with you some of my current research that I'm doing on health equity and medical AI policy. And here's where I'll discuss the notion of a health equity review. And then I'll conclude with some challenges and opportunities for artificial intelligence and machine learning regulation for health equity. And this is where I hope to get some thoughts from the panel moderators and from the audience as well. So let's start with why we should care about AI and health equity. Well, there is growing evidence that the use of AI in medicine can exacerbate already existing health disparities. So, for example, in dermatology, there's evidence that racial and ethnic minorities have less access to dermatology services than white persons, and that in the US, people with dark skin have lower survival rates for melanoma than people with light skin. And so AI that's being developed for dermatology, there's already evidence that these kinds of tools are just exacerbating these already existing health disparities in the field of dermatology, mostly because of the training data that are used to train these machine learning tools. And then another example of why we should care about this intersection of AI and health equity comes from the much cited research by Obermeyer and colleagues, which shows that algorithms that intended to provide healthcare to those who need it most was actually discriminating against Black individuals. And there's another study, a recent study by Pearson and colleagues, which also showed that an algorithm that predicts pain in the knee from medical images that's graded by radiologists does not fully account for racial disparities in reported knee pain. However, when they developed an algorithm with a more diverse data set and trained it to predict patients' own reports of knee pain, this algorithm narrowed the disparities between reports of pain and suggests that the standard measures of severity of osteoarthritis in the knee might be missing, quote, undiagnosed features that disproportionately affect the diagnosis and management of underserved populations with knee pain, unquote. So though this research is from the past 5 years or so, the roots of this go back earlier. So for example, to the ways that medicine using the relatively new technology of computational analysis of genomic data has also proven to have harmful effects on already marginalized groups. And the examples that I have here on this slide show how cutting-edge computational driven genetic analyses can play a role in limiting health equity. So one example that I have highlighted here is the case of a genetic variant that was identified as a high-risk variant for a cardiac condition. And as you can see from the headlines with this question of imprecise medicine, right? Genetic tests leading to misdiagnosis and genetic misdiagnoses and the potential for health disparities, what these two articles are discussing is that the research that led to the identification of this particular genetic variant that was identified as dangerous and risky and increasing risk for this cardiac condition was based on population samples that were not diverse. And so later research that's discussed in the article here and then genetic misdiagnoses article shows that the variant was not actually connected to cardiac disease in other groups. And as a result, Black individuals were told that they had this dangerous genetic variant when they did not. And then in the other example here, reflecting news headlines about a lawsuit for Plavix that was issued in Hawaii, the drug maker, this example has to do with a drug maker that did not include information that their blood thinner, Plavix, may not work as well in some Asian populations due to the frequency of some genetic variants in this population that affect drug metabolization. So the ways that new computational methods have been could be applied to existing and emerging forms of health data led to my research on the Fairness and Precision Medicine project. And I know that many people in the audience are familiar with the term precision medicine, but I want to make clear that in the Fairness and Precision Medicine research that we did not think of precision medicine solely as genetic medicine or synonymous with genetic medicine, but we really use the definition that was put forth by Barack Obama at the launch of the Precision Medicine Initiative, which is an emerging approach for disease treatment and prevention that takes into account individual variability in genes, environment, and lifestyle for each person. So instead of thinking of precision medicine as genomic medicine or genetic medicine, in our precision medicine research, we really thought of it as an approach that aims to analyze multiple forms of data with the ultimate goal of tailoring medical care to the individual. And I'll briefly go over some of the findings of this research as this work informs my current work on health equity policy for artificial intelligence. So in brief, we found in this research, in the fairness and precision medicine research, that data-driven computational precision medicine was vulnerable to bias in the collection and analysis of data, as well as had the potential to exacerbate health disparities and discrimination in its application and its use. And I want to quickly highlight one of our findings about labeling and modeling choices, finding number 4 here in this list of findings around around bias in data sets and analyses. So one of the areas where we identified bias was in this process of labeling clinical data to be used in computational analyses and modeling choices that are used in predictive models. So in this quote here, this is an excerpt from an interview that we conducted with a medical AI developer. And in this interview, I asked him about the process of labeling. And he says here that sometimes the process, and this is labeling clinical data in order for it to be used in a model. And he says here that sometimes the process is simple, but that sometimes this process of creating labels is more complicated, right? So he says, when explaining the example of diabetes, he says, well, there's no label that just says this person is a diabetic patient. They're being prescribed anti-diabetics. They're getting diagnoses of diabetes. They have a lab value that lets you know that they're diabetic, but often the disease you're interested in, there's not a single label that just says, okay, that says yes or no if that patient has the disease. You have to look across the record to find that. And he was explaining how he and other software engineers, other medical AI developers use their own judgments, which can then become part of a seemingly objective or neutral algorithm. And it's this recognition of the potential for bias and human values and judgments to affect multiple aspects of data-driven medicine that led me to connect AI specifically with the potential for worsening health disparities. So in this editorial written with physician Dr. Robert Wynn, we argued that we should address bias in AI, but here in the first point, and we have 2 points here that I'm showing on this slide. So the second point says that we should address algorithmic bias for health equity. And here we frame algorithmic bias for health equity as centrally around sort of bias data. But I want to draw your attention to our first point that we make here about prioritizing health equity in AI in medicine. And so in other words, what we were trying to communicate here is that we should start with the goal of improving health equity with mitigating health disparities for machine learning development. And this was my research on fairness in precision medicine. Specifically, that it's important not just to have representative data sets, but to look at how groups are represented in clinical data, drew my attention to racial corrections in clinical algorithms. Now, these clinical algorithms are not AI algorithms, but they can affect and inform how AI algorithms themselves are used and applied and developed. So many of you may be familiar with this article that was the first that I've seen in the medical literature to really inventory all of the racial corrections that are used across different medical specialties. And here's an excerpt from a table from this article showing the numerous racial correction algorithms that are used in oncology. And what's important about this article and why I think it was so important to this field and to this juncture of thinking about AI and health equity is they highlight the racial corrections that are used, what they are, how they're used, and also what the equity concern is, right? So what the potential danger is of using these kinds of racial corrections. And last month, my colleagues and I at Hopkins published a paper outlining some of the ethical considerations of using racial corrections in lung function testing. So lung function testing is another a clinical area where racial corrections are used and have been used for decades. And so we discuss what some of the ethical considerations are, including how the use of these racial corrections could affect health equity. And I won't go into the details of this article today, but I encourage you to take a look at it because we discuss the ways that ending this process or going to a race neutral approach for pulmonary function testing, what kinds of equity implications that could have, as well as the continued use of these racial corrections, what sort of ethical implications could be had there. And then I just want to say, thanks to research done here at the University of Michigan, the FDA has recently taken action to address how algorithms embedded in clinical tools can also exacerbate health disparities, right? So it has long been known that pulse oximeters do not, because of how they sort of use light to calculate blood oxygen level, are limited with different skin tones, and the algorithms that are used sort of embedded in this tool are problematic. So it's not the same as a racial correction sort of algorithm, but again, this is a really important example, I think, of sort of drawing attention to the ways that algorithms embedded in clinical data, right, change the data itself. So the racial algorithms that I talked about before, the racial corrections, here with the pulse oximetry, it's not necessarily an issue of algorithmic bias stemming from lack of representative data. It goes back to that finding from the Fairness and Precision Medicine Project. Bias doesn't come just from unrepresentative data. We have to also take a deeper look at how people are represented in clinical data, right? How that data itself may already have bias embedded in them. So these racial corrections that are used clinically and the way that pulse oximetry readings themselves could already have bias, right? So you could have a perfectly representative data set of, racially representative data set of oxygen saturation levels, but that could still be biased, right? So that's part of this emphasis on getting representative data sets is important, but that's not the only thing we need to consider when we're thinking about bias in data, and especially the health equity implications of clinical data. So this recent effort by the FDA to address algorithms and clinical data and devices is part of a longer history of the agency regulating software that's in medical devices and software that acts as medical devices. So this is not a complete history, but I just want to call out a few important a few key points in the timeline here of the history. So the FDA has been regulating software for decades, but about a decade ago began formalizing their policies for software that functions as a medical device. So in 2013, the FDA issued their policy for software and medical mobile applications. Then in 2017, the agency announced a pre-certification pilot program. And so this was a way that the agency was shifting from trying to regulate the software themselves to regulating the developers of the software. And then in 2019, the agency also released guidance relating to AI and machine learning. And this was because there was this acknowledgement that AI algorithms, particularly machine learning algorithms, change, right? So if the agency will regulate one software that is a sort of locked algorithm that's not changing, that if there's an algorithm that is constantly changing, right, that there may be important changes that happen to the device even after the agency has already approved it. So in 2019, the agency sort of laid out a way to think about regulating AI tools that, because of their very nature, machine learning, continue to change even after they've been, submitted to the agency for authorization and approval. And then in 2019, when this was released for public commentary, the agency got a lot of feedback on this, and then in last year released an action plan that included some responses to the feedback that they got about this proposed guidance for AI and machine learning in medicine. And then just a few weeks ago, they issued some updated guidance regarding clinical decision support tools and some more specifics about which tools the agency regulates and considers a medical device by their standards and which tools it does not. And so because of that, I thought it would be helpful to just go over when thinking about governing algorithms, at least at the federal level, what's in the the FDA's purview and what's not in their purview. So, for example, what is not in the FDA's purview are what is sometimes referred to as homegrown AI and machine learning tools. So that is tools that are developed within an institution and are only intended to be used within within a healthcare institution, not used outside. So that those types of devices are typically not under FDA's purview. Also, software technologies that may use AI, may not, that have administrative functions like printing medical information. Those kinds of software, maybe AI, maybe not, are typically not regulated as medical devices by the FDA, as well as software technologies that provide lists of recommendations to clinicians but don't diagnose, and are not, as they say in the guidance, quote, not intended to support time-critical decision-making and or replace or direct the healthcare provider's judgment. So again, if a technology is merely providing a list of recommendations as well as with information that to the clinician about how these recommendations were generated, then that kind of technology, it could be AI, it could be not, but wouldn't be regulated by the agency as a medical device. So going back to that history of 2019, when the agency released this guidance around not just artificial intelligence, but machine learning in particular, which is one of the computational models that's been increasingly used in medical AI. I was, let's say, concerned when I read that guidance in 2019, because in that guidance, there was no reference to health disparities in particular. And I will say that I was somewhat alarmed that their proposal for what would be included as in quote unquote good machine learning practices and the total life cycle approach that would be used for regulating the kind of learning and updating AI also did not include substantive attention to health disparities. So I wrote this article in 2020 as a response to that guidance in 2019 and proposed that the agency should consider health equity throughout the AI development process, which was informed by my previous work, that bias in AI, that bias can mark data collection, cleaning, analysis, and that processes of discrimination can affect the application of medical AI even after they are developed. So I want to highlight where I suggested enhancements to the process that the FDA laid out. So on this slide, it's you can see this image is the FDA's diagram, and what you see encircled in red are sort of my enhancements that I proposed to the process, and where I thought an attention to health equity and to health disparities would be key for this proposed regulation. And I'll briefly expand on these. So I included a sort of knowledge of health disparities in the clinical domain of interest, and as a key part of what the FDA mentions as a culture of quality and organizational excellence. I also propose that there's a data bias review that's part of the data selection and management process, that in the model validation process, that there's an attention to group performance, group impacts, and performance decisions, and that once the model is deployed and is being monitored, that real world performance monitoring as they lay out should include a health equity review. So I'll take a little bit of time just to go over sort of each of these in a little bit more detail, each of these enhancements as I call them. So with the first one, an attention to health disparities in the domain of interest, the FDA has 10 principles that it lists that make up good machine learning practice. And one of those principles, principle number 3, is that clinical study participants and data sets should be representative of the intended patient population. And so I want to, again, sort of draw your attention to this focus here as principle 3 is outlined on data representativeness, and to emphasize again, or to say again, that data representativeness is not the only fix for bias in AI model development, right? So as I just discussed with the way that clinical data is already altered by racial corrections, is already altered by clinical tools that may not work as well for particular groups, right? Those issues, I see them as separate from representativeness issues, sample representativeness issues that can also include bias, right? So I felt that an attention to sort of looking at how populations are represented in clinical data, having more of this attention to health disparities in terms of how populations are represented in the data would be useful and would be an enhancement to this principle number 3. And I also argue that knowledge of health disparities in the domain of interest is key, because it can also affect other principles that the agency has laid out as good machine learning practice principles, like principle number 6, which focuses on if the AI tool can safely and effectively achieve its intended use, right? And in my view, thinking about the safe and effective intended use it's important to also consider the health equity aspects of that as well. The second enhancement, data bias review. Again, to sort of make this point one more time, right, to say that it's not just for representativeness of data, that there should be a sort of analysis of racial corrections, latent biases in data, right? And these examples that I discussed sort of illustrate why latent biases can be in data and can be problematic, but also to think of, again, aggregated data that might hide important subgroup differences. And I have here the example of Asian American as a group, right? So again, if you're just relying on data representativeness as your measure, as your metric of whether your data is biased or not, and you might say, okay, well, I have a representative sample of Asian Americans, so that, that should be good, or people who are identified in the clinical data as Asian or Asian American. But especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a lot of research showing the potential, what can be missed when Asian American sort of data is not disaggregated, because there are health disparities within the Asian group, right? That there are some Asian Americans from different countries that have different health outcomes. And again, we saw this during COVID-19, and other public health researchers have done work on this, showing that category actually hides a lot of subgroup differences, which means, again, that there could be bias, right? And if there wasn't a sort of orientation to thinking deeply about health disparities and knowing, for example, that there are health disparities when you disaggregate a racial category like Asian, something like that could be missed in and you might be able to check the boxes and say, okay, great, well, I've done this, I have a representative data set, but yet your model down the line might have this embedded bias in it. And then thinking about group impacts and model decisions and model choices, to just say a little bit more about this and why I think this is an important enhancement to the regulation, is to really hone in on how different choices can, in model calibration, if you will, can impact groups already experiencing health disparities in the clinical condition of interest. So for example, one of the questions that I raise is, should a model have equal performance across groups or have equal positive and negative predictive values across groups? And in the FDA guidance that they issued, those two very different model decisions there was no distinction between those, right? As long as the model was proven to be sort of analytically valid, what sort of choice the model developers made between equal performance or equal positive and negative predictive values didn't quite matter. But my argument is that if you have a sort of health equity orientation, you would think you would bring some additional insight and some additional context to how making those very different model decisions could potentially have a health equity impact, or even ask that question, right? That should be part of the process. And that is what I'm sort of arguing for in this process of adding this health equity orientation to the process that's laid out by the FDA, to ask these kinds of questions that can hopefully reveal biases before they already get sort of built into the algorithm. And again, this question about, well, let's ask about the different kinds of model decisions, again, doubles down on that point of bias in modeling doesn't just happen from the representative data set, right? Because, or the representativeness of your data set, because you could have a representative data set, but there could be health equity implications of depending on the kinds of choices that you make about your model. So again, this enhancement would really involve this question of which calibrations matter for health equity. Oops. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. And finally, sort of thinking about post-market health equity review as another suggested enhancement to the FDA's guidance around regulating AI and machine learning in medicine. This kind of health equity review that I propose would track how the AI, as it's deployed, is affecting marginalized groups on the ground. It would also encourage and track activities undertaken to address unfairness or group harms, even if these activities do not involve changes to the model's inputs and architecture. And I want to say that because part of this guidance, as I mentioned before, came from a need to explain or lay out how the FDA would regulate models that are changing, machine learning models that are changing even after, it's been sort of initially approved. And so there was a lot of emphasis on, well, how would the model's architecture change, and what we have to be really, what developers and the agency should be concerned about is sort of changes in the model's architecture that could make it very different from what was initially proposed and approved. But this, in this point, what I'm saying is that even if the model is still sort of working as it was designed to, or hasn't undergone major changes in its inputs or its architecture, there could be there could still be ways that, as it's being sort of used on the ground, that it's having health equity impacts. And so that we shouldn't just focus our attention, particularly when we're looking at learning models, on whether or not it's changing and if the changes in the models are affecting groups. But even if the models don't change, how might there still be impacts on groups and unfairness? And the last part of this proposal of a health equity review is that aspects of this health equity review, of the sort of post-market deployment review of these tools, would ideally be developed by multiple stakeholders. And this is something that I hope that we can talk more about in the discussion, or maybe from the audience, about how exactly that could happen to involve multiple stakeholders. Okay, and so all of this together, when I think about the addition of these four aspects to the agency's proposed regulation for AI and ML, and also an article that I worked on with some computer science colleagues about sort of thinking through the whole process of machine learning development, all the way from problem selection to post-deployment considerations, and how to include an orientation to justice at all of these points. When I think about these things together, I really think of them as a sort of health equity first approach, or trying to think about an approach of thinking about health equity by design, or by default, and by design, right? So almost, if you're familiar with this idea of sort of privacy by design or privacy by default, right? That you're starting out the process of developing AI and machine learning for health with health equity in mind. And that's what I've been really trying to advance with this work. Oops. Okay. And so with that in mind, I want to just share, I want to use my remaining time, and let me just check the time here, to share with you my current research on health equity for AI policy. And so I'm currently conducting a 10-month exploratory study that's funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts. And it is it includes a few parts of this study. We've tried to jam a lot in 10 months. Is a content analysis of publicly available FDA approval documents of AI devices, qualitative interviews with key stakeholders in health equity and AI policy, including national minority health organizations, national medical organizations, medical device manufacturers, as well as scholars who research health equity, health disparities, and digital health technologies. And this is, if you haven't seen it on Twitter, this is a flyer that we posted on Twitter. We are still doing interviews for the study. So if you think that you would be, you would be in our pool of interviewees, please reach out to me. Or if you know of someone who you think would be a good candidate for participating in our study, please do let me know. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the one part of the study, the content analysis of publicly available FDA approval documents of AI devices. And one of the resources that we are using to conduct this content analysis is a curated database of FDA approved AI devices. And this is the medical AI evaluation database. And as it says here, it's an aggregate of 141 FDA approved AI devices. And this has been a great resource for us because in the FDA's database, it isn't quite easy to identify which tools are AI or not. And so there are a few other of these medical AI databases, and we've used this one and looked at some of the others, and I'll share some of the findings from our using this medical AI database. So just to tell you first about sort of what we're looking at, these publicly available FDA approval documents of AI devices. They are summary documents, so they don't include everything that the AI developer submitted to the agency. They are summaries, and they are in PDF format. And so they typically include something like a cover letter from the FDA to the device maker. There are also some standardized sort of parts of the summary. So the summaries usually include, whether this was a 510K or de novo pathway. So 510K is a device that there is a predicate device, or there was a device that was substantively equivalent. A de novo device is one where there wasn't anything that was similar, and so it's a new device that's being submitted, and sort of information and indications for use that this is some standard information that's usually in these FDA approval summary PDFs. And then there's also typically in these PDFs some discussion of performance testing. Oops, let me go back. Of performance testing and validation of these devices, right? So how were these devices, what were the processes that were used to validate these devices? And there's some information about sensitivity, specificity, as well as what kinds of trials were done. So just some initial findings. So what we are doing is, so we're coding these summary documents. We're coding device functions, the performance testing, we're coding demographics, how risk and safety is described in these documents. And so far, one of the things we found is that from this resource, from the medical AI database, only 16 of the 141 devices had any kind of demographic information included. And this demographic information was a mix of race, gender, and age. So you can see on this chart over here to the right is that most often gender was included, race, ethnicity information was included least often, sometimes age was included, but still the sort of majority of the summaries that we looked at did not have any demographic information at all, which is maybe not surprising because the FDA does not require device makers to include demographic information in their performance testing. So they don't have to necessarily include information about who they tested their devices on. We also found that there was a lot of variation in terms of how performance testing of AI devices is being done. And had been approved by the agency. So some device makers did multi-site testing. So they tested their devices at different clinical sites. Some device makers did two-phase testing or two-phase studies. Some did one-phase studies. Some device makers used simulated users. Some, had trained experts serve as reference. So there was a lot of variety in how these AI devices were tested, but they were all approved. There was also and so one of the things that we are sort of taking away from these from this content analysis is that the variability in demographic information that's shared by providers and the variability in performance testing and how it's done could affect the health equity potential of medical AI. So hopefully it's not too hard to imagine, right, that if there's just a mix of information on how the studies were done, which groups were being included, that it might be difficult to try to assess whether or not these tools could have disparate impacts across groups. And that's just in sort of thinking about the development of the tool. If we think about deployment of the tool, right, because remember, part of my suggestions, right, are how to include an attention to health equity in the development of the tool as well as when it's deployed. When we think about the deployment side and what we're seeing, again, from some of the content analysis that we're doing, is that diagnostic devices in particular have to have mitigation measures to manage the device if there's device or operator failure. So if the device is approved, but then it fails in some way. But again, it's unclear, even though there are those measures in place for, failures when it's deployed, it's unclear how those kinds of mitigation measures could relate to disparate impacts between groups, if that would even be considered a kind of failure of a device, and if that would be viewed as a risk or safety issue. And that's something else that we're looking at as well, is sort of how risk and safety is being discussed in these documents, and if how race or demographics come into or are not included in discussions of risk and safety. So where do we go from here? So I want to talk about just some challenges that I see in this space and some opportunities. So just to quickly go through some of the challenges, the existing sort of policy landscape, I've been talking about the FDA, but really there are a number of federal agencies that that touch this field or this domain in a number of ways. And scholars have noted that between the different agencies sort of potentially being involved, that there are gaps in oversight for emerging technologies such as AI and machine learning. The pre-certification program that I mentioned earlier, it was a pilot to see if this new way of regulating AI from the developer side rather than the tool side, if that would work. And so that pilot program has ended, and it's unclear what the future of that is going to be, if that is really going to be a shift that the agency is going to make. So that's another challenge. There's also the challenge of the capacity and ability for the FDA to review AI applications overall. So there are, device makers who have, talked about the delays in getting their AI applications reviewed because just maybe not enough people at the agency, as well as capacity for people at the agency to be able to have enough knowledge and background in the particular AI application to be able to, review it. And so another challenge is, well, is adding health equity too much? If the agency is already facing limitations in terms of its capacity and the ability for its reviewers to really do substantive reviews of the AI applications that they're already getting, would adding these, as I have said, enhancements, would that be adding too much to an already potentially burdensome regulatory process? And then I have a final, challenge of enforcement. So if this post-market, if there was a post-market health equity review, if health equity was incorporated into post-market regulation, and if that review did find disparate impacts across groups, how would enforcement happen, right? So again, there are other examples of not just the FDA, but other federal agencies who have had the ability to identify where there have been, people doing the wrong thing or devices not acting in the way that they should, but enforcement becomes a problem again because of limited capacity. So just, a few other sort of questions, right? I mentioned this before. If we think about this, the kind of where do we go from here specific to a learning health system? So again, homegrown AIs, if they are used in a learning health system, would not be subject to FDA oversight. And so if we think about that, then who would be responsible in a learning healthcare system for evaluating AI and machine learning and evaluating it for health equity? Would there be some kind of existing governing body, a new governing body? Who would be responsible for doing this kind of evaluation? And then we can also think about how this post-market evaluation for health equity that I've talked about could be useful for a learning health system. But again, how would we actually do that in a learning health system? And what are the metrics that would be useful, particularly in a learning health system? Would it be focused on disparate outcomes between groups or different accuracy rates between groups of AI that are used in the system? Would we only want to do quantitative measures of, outcomes or accuracy rates, or would we also, as part of evaluating, doing a health equity review of AI tools in learning health systems, would we want to do something like a qualitative study, such as this repairing innovation study that some of my former colleagues at Data and Society did, where they looked at, they qualitatively evaluated the use of a sepsis detection tool on the ground and some of the issues that came up there. And so I want to put this to the audience of sort of other points to consider, particularly in a learning healthcare system. What else would we need to consider when thinking about how to regulate AI and machine learning? And then I just want to end with just some opportunities. And where, to end on a positive note or an optimistic note, I should say, the FDA is still working on their action plan for AI and machine learning. It's on the horizon that they will be addressing bias. I, again, want to shout out the University of Michigan and their recent study on sepsis, which really pushed the FDA to clarify guidance on CDS and what is included as a clinical decision support tool, what's considered as a medical device and what's not. There's been a lot of research in the scholarly literature around how to build in transparency tools and models, transparency tools for models and different ideas like nutrition labels and things like that. There was recently the release of the White House AI Bill of Rights, where there was a call out specifically to algorithmic discrimination. So that's putting this notion of algorithms as potentially discriminatory in the public eye, in the forefront of sort of public conversation. And so I think that is an opportunity to look at. And there's also this NIST AI risk management framework that does include attention to bias. It is a voluntary framework, but I think it is encouraging that there's attention to bias there. So just to conclude, again, on a positive note, I love this quote from Lucy Suchman. She's an anthropologist of technology who says that technology isn't the design of physical things, it's the design of practices and possibilities. And I hope that we can spend the rest of our time talking about some of the practices and the possibilities for AI for health equity today. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. That was amazing. So we'll, I think, just sort of go right into the questions. And I'm going to have Paige sort of get us kicked off in that. We have a couple good ones in the chat and I think some of our own. So go.
Great. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really thought-provoking and I think covered a lot of the issues that so many of us are kind of wrestling with as we're thinking about the development and implementation and then the governance of these tools. My first question is, I'm really interested in your perspective as an anthropologist working on this topic, how you think we can better bridge disciplinary silos in these conversations, because anthropology and sociology and all these different disciplines have so much to contribute. But I think often we kind of bump up against these disciplinary silos and struggle to kind of talk to each other across them. So just really interested in your opinion and experience being an anthropologist in this space, and what kind of insights you have for us as we kind of try to bridge these disciplinary silos.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that question. And one of the things that I have been that has been really really enjoyable for me as I've been doing this research is that I have had the opportunity to work with researchers from different disciplines. So as I mentioned, I've done I've written with physicians, with computer scientists, computational epidemiologists, pulmonologists, right? And so what has been, to me, I think so enjoyable is that I have been able to, and really sort of as an anthropologist, right? If you think about what anthropologists traditionally have done is that they try to sort of understand the worldview of another group, right? And I almost feel like when I do these interdisciplinary collaborations, I'm really leaning into my anthropological training and understanding the worldview of my colleagues from different disciplines and not critiquing them or thinking that the way that they view something is wrong, but it is a different way of viewing the world. So very recently, we asked someone about health to define health equity. And this was someone who they're from a computational discipline and they defined health equity in computational terms, right? Like health equity to them is, things that they can measure and that they can, distill into a set of quantitative measures, right? And to me, my viewpoint is not that that's wrong. What do you mean health equity is, quantitative? Of course it's not. It has to do with like society and it has to do with these other things, right? But that is their viewpoint. And so I think the challenge and the opportunity is figuring out how to build those bridges. And one of the things that I have done as an anthropologist working in this area of technology and how I've tried to sort of build those bridges is to I don't want to say expose, but I guess it is sort of expose the ways that technology, data science, quantitative measures, how they're all touched by our values, right? And how they really are all artifacts in the sense of things produced by humans, right? So just as I gave a talk not too long ago where I argued that health data, we should think about health data as artifacts. So just like we would look at an ancient artifact and try to understand, who were the people who made this artifact? What was the society that they were living in? When we look at our health data, right, our artifacts of the present, we can do that same kind of analysis, right? Like, what kind of society is racially corrected data coming from? Who are the people who are sort of producing data that has these racial corrections already in them? So I think, using some of those, leaning on my training as an anthropologist, coming up with some of these metaphors that people, I think, can really understand, and not putting it in a way of like, the way that you're seeing this is wrong, but trying to show the sort of values and recognize and respect different points of views on things, I think is really important.
Great, thank you so much. I think that leads really nicely into a question that we got in the chat about how you think about the role of education for developers, for engineers, for data scientists, kind of helping them learn how to account for bias or think about health equity. And if you have any thoughts about the role of education there.
Yeah, I think education is really important. And as I mentioned in the Fairness and Precision Medicine study, we interviewed software engineers, we interviewed data scientists, and at least based on our interview participants, the data scientists and technologists were really hungry for knowledge about the context and the history of their data. There was even this term that one of the data scientists used that's been picked up by some others, of this idea of data empathy. He actually expressed, he said, I wish that I had more data empathy, right? Meaning that he wished that he knew more about where this data comes from, who produced it, what the contexts were, and like, what it was really about. And it was because he felt like if he knew a little bit more about the history and the context of this data, that he would understand it better. He would kind of have more empathy for the data, if you will, but he would also be able to, do his work better, if you will, right? Create better models with the data if he had a sense of the context. And then, I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of the disparities and social conditions that we see in the US, and I'll just speak to the US context here, many of us, native born Americans, if you will, we were not taught these things in school, right? So there's education that has to be done. I remember having the experience being a graduate student and teaching undergraduates about redlining. And most of these undergraduates had never heard about redlining before because it was not taught to them in high school, right? So I think it's really important. Education is really important for us to sort of understand why our social world looks the way that it looks today, right? It's not because certain people, didn't want to do something or choose not to do something, but that resources were intentionally removed from certain groups. And this is why, things look the way that they do today. So yeah, I think that education is really key.
Great, thank you. We have one more question and a couple of comments sort of expressing thanks and gratitude, and I think our final question again sort of resonates with what we've been talking about from both Paige's question and Bridget's. So Karen Deep Singh is asking about the issue of measurement, noting that there are a number of different fairness measures out there, and that some of these are incompatible and they're just sort of difficult to sort of parse through. So his question is, how do you prioritize which fairness measures to use to evaluate for a given clinical problem?
Great. And I love this question, because this is what I was trying to get to with this point of, it's not just data representativeness, right? That I think it's great that the kind of computer science community really rallied around this idea of data bias as representativeness, and that is clearly a problem. If we look at clinical trials data, it's woefully unrepresentative, right? So yes, clearly data representativeness is a problem, but I'm so happy that this audience member has brought up the issue of other fairness metrics that are not compatible, and what do we do? How do we decide, right? Because once you sort of and that's what I was trying to get to with the discussion around model calibration, right? Like if you are even going to look at performance across groups and you want to have fair performance across groups, which fairness definition across, which fairness metrics across groups are you going to use? And this is why I think having this education, knowledge, background in the health disparity of the clinical condition of interest that you're developing a tool for is so important, right? So if you know in the particular tool that the clinical tool that you're developing an AI for, let's say it predicts some kind of cardiac condition, but you know that in that, for that particular condition, there's already a disparity in, whether physicians even send a certain group to get preventative, follow-on testing or not. Then in that case, you might say, well, you know what? I think I really don't want to sacrifice my accuracy, because because I know there's already a disparity where clinicians already seem to be predisposed to not send people to follow-on testing. So if I have more false positives there, that might exacerbate that disparity. So let me, calibrate more for, higher accuracy then, right? And to make my model as accurate as possible. So it's having that sort of background and context and being steeped in the health equity, health disparity conditions of the clinical issue that you're trying to solve, I think is really important. And so that's where, as I mentioned before, I think including multiple stakeholders in the process is key, right? I think, and you can include multiple stakeholders to help provide this context in the process of development. And again, in the process of development, not just after the tool has already been developed.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you again for your talk. One of the things I love about sort of the way you talk about your work and sort of how you approach these questions is sort of providing not only sort of the critique and the understanding of what we're doing with this new technology, but also mapping that onto the processes of development and really showing sort of where we can sort of have the conversations about improving health equity and sort of and reducing health disparities in our health system. So thank you so much again for your talk, and thank you everybody else for being here. We have our next collaboratory presentation will be in person at the University of Michigan with our colleague Kate Spector-Baghdadi, who will be talking about her work and data sharing. I think with that, we'll wrap it up. And again, thank you so much. And we look forward to sort of continuing a conversation with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for the questions. And thank you to the moderators again.
Yeah.